Welcome to the last video on the Azure Static Web App series. In this video, we are going to look at how to build a sample app to connect to CDS Web API and build upon the concept that we learned on the first two videos. So if you haven't watched my first two videos, I will add to the description below and you can go and watch them first to understand, get some basic understanding of Azure Static Web Apps is, and then after watching those videos you'll be able to understand this better. So let's look at the demo app that I have built. So this is the home page of that, and first thing is I have to log in to access this app because we don't want because this app is connecting to CDS Web API. We don't want anyone in the internet to connect to this. So first step is I need to log in using my Azure AD. So now I am going to log in. After I log in, I am taken into this page, and you notice that there is a pop-up as well, and I am getting the information that I have logged in as this particular AD account. This is on my tenant, so I am using a login on my tenant to log in. So this I have set it up on the Azure Static Web Apps. We'll go through that, and if I click accounts, I have two sections on this page. So on the left hand side is the output from Azure Functions. Like I said in the first two videos, the Azure Static Web Apps has got the static HTML CSS part, and then you also have the Azure Functions. So Azure Functions can be used to do any sort of API. So you have a single gateway function, and the client doesn't need to know anything about how to connect, what the authentication is. They can rely on the function. So that is on the left hand side, like using Azure Functions to connect to the CDS API. And on the right hand side is how you can use the MSAL to connect to the CDS API as well. So that was the pop-up that you saw on the previous page. So when the user lands on that straight after login, you get you log in the user on in MSAL, and then you can get the token on this page. You can get the token and use the token to connect to the CDS Web API. I just want to demonstrate both techniques, like how you can use Azure Functions as well as how you can use MSAL. The difference is, when I'm connecting using Azure Functions, I have a service account, and I'm actually using that service account to do any sort of functions call. While in this MSAL, I'm connecting as the currently logged in user. So if I try to go into solutions, because solution is something that only sysadmin has access to, and the functions user is not a sysadmin. So if I try to go into solutions and then try to access solution ID, it's gonna error out. So like you can see, the functions part errors out because it doesn't have the privilege, while the right hand side I'm using MSAL. MSAL can connect to it and retrieve the data. So if these are the pros and cons, or so if you want to do some operations in the credentials of using the credentials of the currently logged in user, like the currently logged in user of the static web apps, like you probably need to know who the user is and you need to impersonate it. So both are sort of I just want to show both the techniques, and you can choose whichever suits you. So let's dive into the code. So I have published my code into GitHub, and you can follow along this video along with this GitHub repo. So let's jump into Visual Studio Code. So rather than looking at the whole source code file by file, because it will be really boring to go through file by file, and you can basically clone the repo from GitHub and look at it yourself. So rather than looking at that file by file, let's look at some key files just to understand the concepts. So the first is for the static part, you always start with the routes.json. So in my routes.json, when the user lands on the login route, they are served the Azure AD login page. So anything, .auth is like a special route for static web apps. So .auth route/login/AAD is for Azure AD. For GitHub, there is a different route. One for Twitter. It's just like /GitHub and /Twitter. And we do one thing with the welcome.html. With the welcome.html, because we are receiving the parameters in the URL, the URL is like /entity/contact/contact ID. So we are basically getting the contact's logical name as well as the attributes we want to see, like those the logical names of the attributes as well. And since the possibility is endless, like there are so many entities in CDS, we want all of those to be redirected into the welcome.html route. So we are setting up the routes for entity/star. That means anything that has this pattern will be redirected to welcome.html. And then we also set up the allowed roles and who can access certain protected roles. So login is a page that anyone can access. That is an index page. Anyone can access. There is no restriction. But other than that, we want a lot of these roles to be protected. So we are protecting the welcome route, API, entity list. All these routes can be accessed only by authenticated users. This is the Azure Functions code. If we navigate into API, Dataflex Function App, we have the index.ts. So that is the code for the Azure function. Even in the Azure function, we have a custom route. So you can see we have the binding data.entity name and binding data.attributes. These are coming from the URL, and the way to set it up is in the function.json. If I go into the function.json, I have the route set up. So the route is in a pattern, entity name and attributes, and that those parameters from the URL can be used directly on the function code. In this app, we use authentication using MSAL. That is a pop-up you saw when you initially log in, as well as we also have authentication on the Azure Function app. So in the Azure Function app, I am using, after registering the app using Azure AD, I am using the client ID and client secret to authenticate to the CDS API. So that part is actually done using the Azure Identity NPM package. I am using a class called environment credential, and environment credential grabs the required details, as in like what is application ID, what is client secret, all in the application settings. When you are developing this locally, you will put that in the local settings.json. So the part about getting the token is this line, on line number 24. We get the token, and the resource we want to get the token for is just the client URL, and the scope is the default scope. So when we get a token, we want to also have a scope for it. So this is the default scope. And if we go and look at the local settings.json, I have set up all the details that is used by the function app on this local settings.json. This file is useful when you are developing this locally. So I have the client ID, Azure _ client ID. I have the Azure _ client secret, and I also need the Azure _ tenant ID. These three are required by the environment credential. And I also have put in a CDS URL because I am just using that on my code to I don't want to hard code the base URL on the function app. So I've actually put that. So once I actually grab the token, once I send the token request using this environment credential, I will get the token in the response, and I can use that token in my web API calls, the CDS web API calls. I am also using this package called XRM web API. So that is an NPM package that I use. That is this package XRM-web API, and that package takes in the token directly, and I can basically query the CDS web API. So in this particular code, I am simply grabbing I'm just saying retrieve multiple. I want to retrieve multiple records based on the entity name, and these are the attributes I want to retrieve. So this is the functions part. Now let's look at how to do the authentication in just using MSAL library. So in MSAL, first we set up some basic values like what is a client ID, that is this part, what is a client ID, what is the authorization endpoint, and after the token is obtained from the authorization endpoint, where do we redirect the user to. So we need to set up those details. And the very first time the user after the user logs in, they are redirected into the entity list page. So at that point of time, we need to grab the we need to actually create the session. So we need to log in the user. So we need to call this function called login popup. And we also always need to, because this is a 2.0 MSAL 2.0, we always need to have a scope. So after we do the login, so you momentarily see a pop-up, and then after we do a login the very first time, after that point on, you should be able to grab the token silently on the background. So that is a part where we are acquiring the token silently, and the difference in MSAL1 and MSAL2 is, with MSAL1 you never had this thing as mandatory. The account parameter was not mandatory. Now we need to actually pass the account parameter, and we always need to pass the scope. So what is the scope for the retrieving the token and logging in the user? The scope is just the base URL of the CDS instance, and then we don't explicitly specify any scope. We just say /default, and the only scope there is as per the app registration is user impersonation. So that is how you retrieve the log in the user and retrieve the token in using MSAL 2.0. So like you can see here, we have the MSAL 2.0 library, and also in the entity list we also have the MSAL 2.0 library. So we are in the previous instance we used the functions, and in the functions we use a single service account. Regardless of whoever the user has logged in, it will use that same service account to query the data. But with MSAL we will be using the credentials, or we will basically query CDS as the user who is currently logged in into the static web app. So that is the difference between like the functions, using functions service account based authentication, and using MSAL and using the currently logged in users credentials. So now let's look at how the app registration is set up. Right after you create a new app registration and save it, you will not have any other details configured apart from this first page. So that will be the application ID and all those other ones. And the only thing you need from a CDS integration perspective is the application ID. You need this application ID because you need to set up a application user in CDS and give that particular application user relevant security roles. So you need to actually copy this application ID and set that up on the CDS side. And after you do that, you can come and configure your client secret and client secret. This is required for the connection string. So I have set up a couple of secrets. I am actually using the application ID and client secret method to connect to CDS. In CDS you have 3 or 4 different ways you can connect. You can do OAuth, you can do Office 365, you can use certificates, and client ID client secret is also one of the way. So in order for that to work, you need to set up the secret here. First you need to set up the application user on CDS, and you need to set up the secret here, and you'll use both of them in your connection string to connect to CDS. And then if you have then you need to configure the API permissions. For CDS you need to actually it's still called dynamic CRM, it's not called CDS. If you click add permissions and if you check, there is this thing called dynamic CRM, and that's what it's still called. It's not called CDS or anything, it's still called dynamic CRM. And you need to, there is only one particular scope, that is a user impersonation, and need to set that up for the CDS integration. And there are a couple of quick starts on this particular area. After you did after overview, you have the quick start area. In the quick start areas, there are some sample codes that you can check out to see how to connect to using MSAL or ADL. But there is not any sort of templated out code for auth code flow. We have implicit flow. If you check implicit flow, you can see after this diagram you have a sample code which we basically can copy paste. We have and this one is actually version 1.0 of MSAL. But if you go into, we are using MSAL 2.0. So if you go into the quick start area for a single page application and you check this auth code flow, this actually uses MSAL 2.0. And the flow is explained here on this diagram. We have the authorization endpoint. So that is the endpoint that the user has to first connect to grab the authorization code. And there is a token endpoint. So you need to use the authorization code to connect to the token endpoint and grab the access token and ID token and refresh tokens. The token that you send as the bearer, you send the token in the bearer on the header, that is the access token. So that access token will be sent along with your request to the resource that you want access to. In our case, it is CDS. So we will be sending that token into the CDS web API URL, and the token will go on the header as a bearer token, and you'll get a response. But so that is just the working of it. But if you look at the bottom of it, there is just the script part and there is no sample code or anything. So there is a tutorial. You have to click into the tutorial and it just tells you how to connect to MS Graph. But there is no sample code that you can copy paste, just like the implicit flow. Earlier, when we used to do authentication, a lot of times you would click this access token and ID token, and then we just say implicit flow. But right now, that this kind of implicit flow is discouraged. There is a security area now, and if you check the security area, it does actually discourage the use of implicit flow. So the security area is in this if you click this link called Integration Assistant. Integration Assistant does some sort of security check. So it says that even for client ID and client secret, it says you'd rather use a certificate. But authorization, we are using authorization code flow, so there is no warning for implicit grant. If you are using implicit grant, you will get a warning here. So this is like a new area that tells you what are the best practices in terms of configuring the Azure AD. So now we have looked at the authentication side of it. Let's look at what is happening on the network when we load the page. Apart from the API calls, I just want to focus on this one particular endpoint that's called .auth.me. This is the one you would actually call. This is the special static web apps URL that gives you details about the currently logged in user. So if I go into this request, I can see the response. In the response, I am able to get details about the identity provider that the user used to log in, what is their username, what is their user ID, and what are the roles that the user has. So we get all those other details in that special endpoint. So if you want to grab some information about the currently logged in user and do something with it, this is the endpoint to use, .auth/me. And then we have two requests. So the first request is you can see this is the Dynamics URL. Straight away with the Dynamics URL, I am just grabbing the name from the accounts entity. And if you check the header, I actually send the authorization. I can see that I am just sending the bearer token because I already have the bearer token when I used MSAL. And this one, the last one is /API/account/name. So this is the API as in like the Azure Functions URL. So with this Azure Functions one, we don't really send any sort of special bearer token or anything. Then if you look at the headers for the web API, as in like the Azure Functions call, we don't really send any special bearer token or anything. All that is handled on the server side by the Azure Functions. So in terms of limitations that I encountered on the Azure Functions, of the static web app, there is no support for managed identity, because when we have a Azure function, a standalone Azure function, we can set up that Azure function and run it as managed identity, and we can set that managed identity user as a user in CDS. So the whole token is done transparently. We don't need to explicitly call the token or anything. But since there is no support for managed identity in static web apps, the API side, we are forced to use the client ID and client secret and app registration to do that. I have logged in an issue in GitHub for this particular thing, and this is the issue, and hopefully this will be addressed in the future. So hopefully this video would have given you a good overview of Azure Static Web Apps and the potential of this to use alongside CDS. So if we have any sort of portal or form or anything that you don't need a full-fledged Power Apps portal, you need to build some page that connects to CDS API. This is a possible candidate that you can consider. For additional documentation, we can go into aka.ms SWA docs, and when you're creating a new static web apps, it's rather than handcraft every HTML and JavaScript or anything like that, you can use like frameworks, like you have the popular frameworks like Gatsby or Hugo or all these. There is exhaustive documentation about all of those frameworks. I didn't want to delve into that in this video, because this is not a video about these frameworks, but rather than the static web apps themselves. So you can actually complete some learn modules on if you are interested in doing something in Vue or React and how to use static web apps with that. You can refer to this learn content. There is a lot of content, so it will be a good place to for you to learn how to build a professional site using these frameworks. So this completes the 3-part series about introduction to Azure Static Web Apps. Hopefully you learned enough information in these videos to start exploring Azure Static Web Apps. Subscribe to my channel, and you can also follow me on Twitter at Rajvai Raman. Thank you once again.